Let's turn to Schelling's views on ethics. If all this is true, how should we live? We are inherently free and have a natural desire to shape the world to our own liking. Only he who has tasted freedom can feel the desire to make over everything in its image, to spread it throughout the whole universe. But the will, though naturally drawn in this direction, must restrain itself. To achieve great things, we must be self-confined. Mastery is revealed in limitation. So the picture here is in one way similar to Fichte's. We have a will. We necessarily have a sense of our own freedom, and that means we would like to make the world over in our image, to make it conformable to our will, to our desires. But there are limitations to that. We recognize only part of this is under our control, even if it's entirely a realm of phenomena. Only some of those phenomena are things that are under our power. Moreover, well, that itself doesn't tell us what to do. It doesn't really give us that much insight into the nature of ethics. I have to recognize my own limitations. That seems important. I think that's a critical component of the Greek virtue of sophrosune, often translated as moderation or self-control or temperance. But Schelling says, really, in the end, most ethical problems arise from a conflict between a sense of justice and a quest for our own self-interest. There are certain things we want that would be good for us, but we recognize that in some ways these things would be unjust to someone else. Now, sometimes, in short, we run into limits in the world, like, wow, that would be great, but I can't achieve it. Other times, the limits involve other people. I'd love that, but it's really unfair to someone else. So in both ways, there are severe limitations on us. The world limits our freedom, but also other people limit our freedom. Now, not necessarily by preventing us from doing things, but by implying that it would be unjust for us to do certain things. Well, how do we get that sense of justice? What role is it playing? Does it arise, as Fichte thinks, out of a second-person recognition that other people are just like us? Schelling says the central problem of ethics is the clash between our natural desire for happiness and the will's concern for justice. That's what leads us to the problem of temptation. We want things that it would be unjust for us to have. And he says, why do we have that concern for justice, that sense of justice, that desire for justice from the very beginning? If we think that self-consciousness is something that is achieved, rather than really built into the nature of consciousness itself, as Fichte had thought, we're going to have to change our ideas about that. At some point in the development of our self-consciousness, we become aware of this obligation of justice. We develop that sense of justice. How exactly does that take place? Now, Schelling is writing at a time when that's been a major concern of ethicists, not only in the German tradition, but in the British and Scottish traditions as well. In fact, Adam Smith, in the Theory of the Moral Sentiments, talks a great deal about this and talks about empathy, the ability to imaginatively put yourself in somebody else's place, as critical to understanding this. Now, in Schelling, I'm not sure that there really is a developed account of how that sense of justice arises from the development of self-consciousness, but he thinks it does. And so the difficulty here he faces, and I think the reason he doesn't have anything very determinate to say about it, is that it happens along the way to self-consciousness. Now, if it happened as part of consciousness and self-consciousness wrapped together, as Fichte thinks it does, then we could give an account because we're self-conscious. We're aware of ourselves and aware of that from the beginning. If it's like Hegel, we could say, well, okay, it happens at this particular stage of the process. But if that development is shot through with contingency and is driven by unconscious forces that are to a large extent inaccessible to us, then Schelling doesn't just not have a view, he in a sense can't have a view. It's something that at the stage it's happening, we're incapable of understanding. And later we look back and we say it's driven by contingent unconscious forces that aren't really intelligible to us. So he starts, in a sense, from that sense of justice. It's a given to us once we attain that sort of self-consciousness. It's not something that we can fully understand. We can't understand its genesis. We can't really understand whether it has some kind of justification. It's something that simply arises through the development of the self, and in particular of self-consciousness. So Schelling concludes, man has been placed on that summit where he contains within him the source of self-impulsion toward good and evil in equal measure. The nexus of the principles within him is not a bond of necessity, but of freedom. He stands at the dividing line. Whatever he chooses will be his act, but he cannot remain in indecision, because God must necessarily reveal himself, and because nothing at all in creation can remain ambiguous. We find ourselves teetering on the edge between good and evil. We can't just stay there. We have to go in one direction or another, partly because of the absolute, but partly because we can't just remain in this vague borderline region all the time. We have to make choices. And so how do we do it? Well, we're free to go this way or to go that way. And ethics is all about why we should go this way instead of that way, why we need to limit our own desire for happiness to take account of our own sense of justice, something that is not really innate in us, but develops for reasons we can't fully understand as part of the development of self-consciousness itself. The best we can do is to create, not only create a life for ourselves, create a world for ourselves, but create ourselves in the process. We are the authors of our own lives. We are the creators of our own personalities. Man's being, he says, is essentially his own deed.